very good afternoon to one and all. Before I share a short story, let me take a moment and laud the efforts of the wonderful team that has put together this event. It feels like a full circle moment for me when I come back to my alma mater, not as a student, but as a speaker who gets to share insights on a topic that I've gained a lot of passion for over the years. The theme for this year's TEDx being Edged, that is explore, discover, grow, engage, and develop, holds a lot of relevance in each of our lives today, for the mere fact that each of us are extremely ambitious human beings. So over the course of the next 12 to 14 odd minutes, I hope to drive home the message that each of us sitting here today have experienced some form of disability in our lives, or have been caregivers to kith and kin with varying degrees of physical limitations. Moving on, I'd like to share a story of a child who grew up her formative years in the comfortable cocoon of her mother's presence, with intermittent phases of erratic rashes all over her limbs and face. A physical disposition which more often than not attracted the gaze of sympathy or disgust from acquaintances or peers. Every time this child was subject to or was aware of the attitudinal indifferences or overt and covert instances of discrimination, there was a silent resolve to do whatever it takes to rise above it all. On that note, hello from the child whose life you just got a sneak peek into. I am Jelsyna Chacko, a legal journalist with India's leading legal news portal. It is at this juncture that Steve Jobs' quote resonates a lot with me. He said, "Life only makes sense when you connect the dots looking backwards." The stigma attached to having a troubled, patchy appearance growing up manifested not only in the lowest self-esteem, but also made this child experience over 12 severe bouts of temporary disability, which were mostly stress-induced. And there was always a constant quest to prove myself at every stage in life that I am good enough. Research shows that persons with disabilities often have an unspoken pressure of having to prove of being good enough in any given setup. It is at these instances when the constitutionally guaranteed right to dignity seems like an utopian concept. To what extent must we go to show that people with disabilities provide great contributions to the world? How can we demonstrate creating a more accessible world benefits people of all ability levels? And must we benchmark the societal value of persons with disabilities in order for them to gain respect? The United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities narrative of every person being inherently worthy by virtue of being a human being seems to be an academic concept that seems to have gained massive approval in letter, but not quite in spirit. It is a sad reality today that disability remains largely ignored, unnoticed, and disregarded in policy making. In my quest to explore the missing puzzle of the rights guaranteed on paper and their starkly crude outplay on ground, I realized on conducting a survey of students with disabilities the dire need for sensitization across stakeholders in educational institutions. In the survey conducted of 40 students with disabilities, it came to light that over 77% participants experienced some form of social exclusion. 70% participants were at the receiving end of facing some form of administrative rigidity. 99% participants who were visually impaired persons experienced exclusionary teaching pedagogies. Often, exclusion manifests as an inherent thought of persons in authority that persons with disabilities constitute only a minuscule minority, and to that extent, providing reasonable accommodations may seem like an impracticable solution. When we talk about access and inclusion, we aren't only talking about persons with disabilities, but we are talking about all persons universally, with or without disability. It is also a stark reality that persons with disabilities experience higher healthcare expenditure. According to a recent report, India's out-of-pocket expenditure in healthcare is a whopping 55% of the total healthcare expenditure, which is 3 times more than the global average, which is 18%. Employers hiring persons with disabilities need to factor this in, given the anticipation of the many healthcare expenses that can arise. Persons with disabilities who are entrepreneurs need to be supported, not in the traditional sense of the term, but allow them to help you in what it is that you want. When designing policies across domains, sectors, institutions, workplaces, keeping disability at the fore is crucial, and what we say in political parlance, have a tough attitude. As Tanya Massey very rightly said, and I quote, "The only true disability is the inability to accept and respect differences." According to the World Health Organization, over 1 billion people live with some form of disabilities. In the Indian context, according to the 2011 census, when only 7 disabilities were recognized legally, this number stood at over 21 million people. And today, you can only imagine what the numbers or statistics would look like when the number of disabilities have increased from 7 to 21. And that's not all. Many individuals who live with invisible illnesses are not even considered as persons with disabilities. And these conditions can range from, say, chronic pain and fatigue, or mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. During the passing of the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the focus of disability had shifted from the medical model of disability, which captured disability in the body of the individual, to the social model of disability, which envisages and emphasizes on the social and physical barriers that augment the disability of an individual, thereby making life a little more difficult for persons with disabilities while navigating routine and living their full lives as equal citizens and while participating in the society. The Harvard Disability Project has documented the reality that most persons who have experienced disabilities, and especially chronic illness, are at a higher risk of ending their lives. That is right. Let that sink in. Now, how do we broaden our horizons when we are talking about an overly sensitive subject like disability rights? I'm reminded of my second year in law school when I met Professor Shamnath Bashir. I'm sure most of you must be knowing about him. And for those from the non-legal background, he was a revolutionary par excellence, who was the face of disability rights and inclusion and also intellectual property rights. He once very poignantly mentioned, and I quote, "We are all blessed with some disadvantages in life, but converting them into our advantages is our job, that is our duty." If I had to give a glimpse of my life realities, it looked something like this. Admittedly, the words of Professor Shamnath Bashir had stuck with me for good ever since. And I found myself carving my life purpose by sifting my many advantages from the many disadvantages that life threw at me. Living the first quarter century of my life with what you just saw, alongside being a caretaker to my mother, who has a disability of over 80% owing to an accident, was nothing short of the worst nightmare that anyone could have had at that point in time. But on a side note, all those agonizing years later, today, my mom and me are like the kindergarten kids who are left unmonitored, jovial enough to cause ruckus to our immediate surroundings. That's us. But cumulatively, all of these experiences put together made me realize and made me aware that it is extremely important and imperative to maneuver conversations and narratives on disability to explore and emphasize the many possibilities of life and the opportunity to live really rewarding and fulfilling lives. These conversations about disability can be extremely difficult to have, but they're important conversations in order that persons with disabilities, and by extension, all persons, can live better lives. In my attempt to bring such stories to the fore, I decided to start a podcast by the name The Speak Synergy. The podcast was conceived and born as an afterthought of having experienced significant turning points in my own life, and with the intent of creating a platform for persons with disabilities and to capture stories of resilience and strength through and despite disability. Having featured stories of diverse individuals, from a youth who braved cancer at 17, to a mother who lost her daughter to a car accident, and a Supreme Court advocate on record who is navigating life and law with an invisible disability, a 12-year-old motivational speaker who is a brand ambassador and has overcome 2 relapses of brain tumor and a resulting visual impairment, another who has survived and thrived through tuberculosis diagnosis and has most recently won the patent opposition against Johnson & Johnson, a pharmaceutical giant, for an anti-TB drug, bedaquiline. That's them. If there is one message that all of this should reach you, it is that persons with adversities or persons with disabilities can live extremely rewarding and fulfilling lives and thrive despite their circumstances. And as Brené Brown had rightly said, and I quote, "What you go through in this life could be a survival guide for someone else." I'll conclude with a small spoken word poem which I hope will change the way you look at persons with disabilities or with persons with chronic illnesses. I speak to you not as a person garnering sympathy for the disabled. To the contrary, I speak to you as someone whose life experiences were enabled by unlocking the many potentials she has embodied within her personhood, to amplify the voices of the disregarded and shine the limelight on stories that get shrouded in oblivion, to advocate for the marginalized as a means to empower, educate, and make the rights real for persons with disabilities. We, as a community, are winners on the cutting edge of reality creation, resilient, brave, and imperfectly perfect. Treat us at par with everyone else and watch us bloom, not as individuals who are the source of persistent gloom. We cannot and ought not to be limited to academic literature and rhetorics. We deserve to be on the same pedestal as everyone else. Seek our counsel and perspectives when making things more accessible and inclusive. In education, workplaces, and soul places, and among peer groups also. And as the famous tagline of the community goes, there can be nothing about us without us. So the next time you see someone with a disability or a chronic illness, ask yourself what you can do to enable a more level playing field. Because effecting reform in disability rights cannot be limited only for persons with disabilities, but for all persons to show steadfast support and effect change. And as Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. As allies, it is on us to make a mark by incrementally bending this arc towards greater disability justice. Thank you.